Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection, how we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways, how our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics, how this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Well, friends, it's been 5 weeks since the podcast launched, and there are 6 weeks until the election, a little bit under, 42 days to be exact, from the date this episode drops. Because the podcast launched with 3 episodes, we've actually had 12 episodes to date, and hopefully we'll have 12 more before the election. So it's midterm. And I felt like it was a good idea to do like a midterm, mid-season check-in and specifically connect with all of you to talk about some of the highlights from the season thus far, what has happened, and also what you can look forward to. So if you've been listening to every episode, this episode will hopefully help you ground into what you've learned thus far, to sort of reconnect and revisit what's been going on, and to maybe just think about some of the things that you've learned. And if you're behind on episodes or just jumping in with this episode to start, this episode can be sort of a bit of a roadmap for what you want to go back to, what episodes you want to prioritize, and what you can expect moving forward. So before we get into the highlights, I would love to hear how you're doing. How are you liking the podcast? Has it been helpful for you? Informative? What are your key takeaways? I would seriously love to know. I'm not just saying that. So please comment on the posts on social media or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or you can always leave a comment on any of the episode pages, which are on the website at www.theconnectedway.com/podcast. And there's a page for each of the episodes, and you can actually leave a comment on each of the episodes. And I also share those with guests if there are any. So, and then of course, you can always message me or DM me through the website or on Instagram or any social media platform. So I'm really serious. Please share how this is helping you or how you're feeling about it, what you think. I'm totally open to feedback. It's an open door. So, okay, let's get into the goods. As you know, the Connected Way podcast will eventually be about all things connection, exploring and helping you to discover and enhance your connection to your connected self, your inner wisdom, your soul self. It's about exploring how you can connect more deeply in relationship with others, and then also helping you live from the truth of our interconnectedness to the land and all things. And probably especially, it will be about spiritual connection, however that looks for you. It's going to be about connecting with guests about their own spiritual experiences and their own spirituality, but also talking to teachers so that we can open up our eyes and perspectives on different ideas and different concepts and spiritual teachings. But as you also know, I was called very urgently to start the podcast quicker than I had planned. It really wasn't a plan exactly. It was more of like I know that I'll do this eventually. And then all of a sudden I had to do it immediately by looking at the upcoming election through the lens of connection, which was totally surprising to me. My intention with this first quote unquote season of the podcast, basically until the election, was to help people like me to get reconnected. People who have been feeling disconnected or disenchanted from politics to get reconnected, to get engaged, to be able to make an impact if they wanted to, because I was feeling lost in how can I have the most impact? And I realized that other people were feeling that way and other people had been feeling disconnected. And so I thought, okay, as I learn about this, why don't I bring people along for the ride? And that felt very compelling to me. And I also heard from a lot of people that they wanted me to do that. In addition, as a minister, I wanted to look at how spirituality and religion intersect with politics because it's fascinating to me. Of course, Christianity is very much at play in this election, but I also wanted to look at other religions. Obviously, as an interfaith, interspiritual minister, all the religions are interesting to me and compelling to talk about. So I wanted to look at other religions and spiritual teachings to understand how they could inform politics and people's voting decisions, and also what the teachings had to say in relation to some of the policies that are at play right now. And finally, I wanted to bring connection to the forefront of how we make a difference. So the country seems obviously at this point to be almost two polar opposites, seemingly more than ever. And it's as if people are not able to talk to each other, and that's not helping. It's just these extreme sides, and there's no sort of middle ground of connection. So I wanted to look at how we could connect amidst all these differences. And even though it feels like people are sort of on opposite extremes, my understanding and sort of what I was seeing and curious about is if there are people who aren't on those extremes, who feel isolated or left alone, or they're not even sure how to engage. They don't know what to think, but also they feel a little lost or maybe marginalized or not considered. And so I felt like, what if we could connect with those people and understand what connection looks like? And could that then help move the needle with this election? And so in general, I want us to look at how we can connect with one another. And then finally, to me, in relation to the connected way, this election feels like a choice between connection and disconnection, between individualism and collectivism, choosing to take care of ourselves as individuals or taking care of the whole. So it relates deeply to the vision and mission of the connected way. And I also see that this election is part of a much larger sort of evolution of our society, I hope, moving from individualism to collectivism. And I wanted to share with you some of what I've seen with that, but also learn more about that. So clearly these intentions were not so small. Once I realized what I wanted to cover, it was clear that I was going to need to do more than one episode a week, which is what I had originally planned. And I imagine is also what will probably happen after the election. But until the election, I started to realize, okay, this needs to be 2 episodes a week. So that is still the plan until the election, but it depends a whole lot on guests. And I've learned that that can all change basically day to day. I'll share a bit more about that experience later. But first, I want to talk about what we've covered, some of the highlights, and what you can expect in the next 6 weeks. So I have personally had some major aha moments that I keep thinking about from these conversations with guests in particular. And I'm going to go through each episode and share like my key takeaways and the big moments or the quotes that have really stuck with me. And obviously you can go back and revisit each of the episodes, either on the website, you can link directly to that episode, or you can go into wherever your podcasts are, wherever you get your podcasts, and find the number of the episode, which I will mention with each, if I remember. So, okay. The first episode was me sharing my story and background, how the vision and mission of the Connected Way came about, what the Connected Way is on both the individual and collective level, striving to live a life focused on connection, and also a societal shift from toxic individualism towards collectivism. And then, so that was me solo. So if you want to learn more about me, about my background, about how I got here, about what I believe, and about what the Connected Way is, that is the place to look, is episode 1. I'm not going to share key highlights on that one or the second episode because that just feels weird. And then in the second episode, I shared why I was starting by talking about the election. I am not a political expert. I am not a political strategist, but why was I talking about the election and what was the point? And bottom line on that one, I guess you could call this a highlight, is that I felt called to it and felt like I didn't have a choice. But also, once I sort of received that call, I realized there was a lot to cover as it relates to connection and this election. And perhaps it was one way I could contribute to affecting change with this election and beyond. I want to mention one thing about that episode and about what I just said, because people have asked me about this. The word called is something that's used often in spiritual language, and a lot of people don't understand it, which I totally get. I think, if you had asked me 15 years ago, like, hey, what if you were called to do something? I would probably have no idea what you were talking about. So I have been called to do a couple of things in my life. And one of them was going to seminary. One of them was the Connected Way. And now this. And I think when I say that I've been called to things, it's almost like I'm being propelled forward from an intuitive place. Sometimes it comes in the form of an actual message, like, you need to do this. It's time. You need to do this. And it often happens over and over again. And it's like an internal knowing that I cannot avoid. These experiences have come to me after I surrendered and started to listen to like the small voice within me that's much louder now, that is my guidance system, my internal system of connection that comes from me being connected to myself, my big S self. And I will share a lot more about this later, but I wanted to explain because people have asked me, what does it mean that you were called to do this? So I had this internal guidance say, you need to do this podcast right now. And I had known, I'd been feeling for 6+ years, like there's a podcast eventually. And then all of a sudden that internal knowing, that internal message became so strong. And then often this happens, and it happened with this. I also had external experiences, like where I was talking to someone and they would say something and they would be like, oh, it would be so great if you did this. And I was like, wait, what? Okay, weird. And so external circumstances line up with the internal circumstances to validate what I am feeling and experiencing enough that I like motivate to take the action. So that's how it happened. That's what it means that I felt called. Okay, enough about that. So let's get into the juice, which is all these incredible guests that we've had in all the episodes since the first two that I did on my own. So let's start with episode 3. Episode 3 was the first guest episode in which Michael Gaudini, who is a city councilor in Pennsylvania, he's a policy professional, he's an activist, and like all around political buff, just a wealth of knowledge, shared some insights into how our government is structured, who we vote for when, like how elections work with Congress, what the different responsibilities are for different people in Congress, and also what politicians experience, which I was excited to talk to him about. So there are 2 key highlights for me in that episode, 2 like main takeaways. One is that he and I talked about something that I realized about a year ago, which is that a lot of politicians are not paid. Many of them are paid very little. And it's especially like down ballot, more local politicians that don't get paid. So they are considered civil servants, which I know. And I didn't actually get into this with Michael, but I kept thinking about it after the fact. Think about that for a moment. Civil servant. To me, it is ridiculous that we would ask people to do such a serious job as a servant or as a volunteer. And the word servant is a tough one. And no wonder so many people that are in these roles are people of privilege. White men, basically. Because they have the luxury to be politicians. They have other income. They have other people or other things that they can lean on. Maybe they're retired and they are, they're reaping the rewards of the work that they've done, but they do not reflect us as a country or as a society. And a lot of that is because a lot of people who would reflect us don't have the luxury of being a servant. Also, so much about the idea of being a luxury of being a servant is really strange to be saying. But that is the system right now. The system clearly needs to change. And it's something that I am very passionate about right now. So it's one of the things that clearly is wrong with our system and needs to change eventually. So the other key takeaway for me was that he also shared how important it is to get involved in local races and get involved in local politics, because getting involved in local races that have a lot less publicity is so good for your local government. So, for example, if you go and door knock for a city councilor and you're able to have a conversation with people, they may have otherwise showed up at their polling station and not known any of the city councilor candidates. And so you're actually helping to create exposure around people that are unknown, as opposed to having conversations about things that are much more known. And also, it turns out, which I didn't know, Michael shared this with us, that if you have a conversation about like a down ballot candidate, it may also impact the candidates that they vote for up the ballot. And when I say down ballot is very local. It's a quote unquote smaller role. It is not small at all. But the president is at the top of the ballot, and down the ballot is the more local. So I just thought it was really interesting to think about where we get involved, because I think a lot of us think like, hey, we need to be pushing the big races, when in reality, actually, a lot of the smaller races are really important to get involved with. And later guests, Andrew Zaro and Brian Derrick, both also validated that as well, that it's really important for these smaller races that can have major impact to get involved in those and also to donate to them, which I'll talk about in a minute. So, okay. Episode 4 was the first Sunday episode. And in case you haven't noticed, I've done my best to have Sunday episodes be more spiritual or religious. And then Wednesday episodes are sort of more political and strategic. So this was the first Sunday episode. So my seminary teacher and now friend, Reverend Dr. Sushmita Mukherjee, was the first of those guests to join us, the first spiritual teacher. And this was such a dynamic and rich conversation. But I would say a highlight was our agreement and discussion around the capitalistic white supremacy culture that we live in. It is the culture that we live in. We live in white culture, and how it breeds disconnection, and how we need to listen to and learn from the marginalized, especially the queer women and people of color who are the leaders that are really showing us the way forward. And Sushmita pointing out how white culture also makes us, those of us who benefit from it, it makes us incredibly lonely, heartsick, and disconnected, was sort of baffling because it's so true. And for me, as I've learned about white culture and white supremacy culture in the past many years, I really think about, okay, what are the changes that we need to make so that we're not having this impact? And I've thought a lot about hustle culture and how that's affected us and how it's disconnected us. And I've thought about the disconnection element, but I haven't thought as much about how lonely and heartsick it makes us. So that one has really been sitting with me. And I really appreciate her bringing that into the conversation. Okay, so our guest for episode 5 gets some credit for me actually following through with taking the leap to start this podcast. He was sort of one of those external influences that validated that I needed to do this. So Andrew Zaro was my district city councilor, and then he ran for mayor last year. He sadly lost by a slim margin, but he was incredibly impactful as a councilor while in office and is still an activist and incredibly involved. And I got to know Andrew originally when he was my district councilor because there were some hot issues that I got involved in. And he started then recruiting me to get more involved. And he's sort of been my entry into political involvement locally. And he has also shamelessly encouraged me to get more and more involved. So when I felt compelled and sort of had this calling to do the podcast, he was one of my first calls. I wanted his thoughts on me doing a podcast when I'm not a political expert and, what I was thinking and he was thrilled. So thrilled that he helped me brainstorm and come up with a couple of the topics that I wanted to cover in the political sphere. And we had this amazing conversation while walking, and it was great. And so he could have been a guest on so many episodes, but we figured out to narrow it down to two of the most important topics that were also the most time sensitive because they're about how people can get involved. And so those two topics were voting and volunteering. As you have heard me say, if you've been listening, there are three ways in my mind that I think as citizens we can really have an impact: voting, volunteering, and donating. And in Andrew's episode, there were so many highlights around voting and volunteering, but there is one that absolutely stood out for me. And I think about this all the time and have brought it up on other episodes because it keeps coming up. So when talking about the wild voter suppression tactics that have been implemented, he said, quote, "Apathy is the downfall of democracy." I'm going to say that again because I think it's so important. Apathy is the downfall of democracy. Apathy. Democracy thrives when people disagree. It dies when people stop caring. Whoa. Okay, whoa. I keep thinking about it, and I think I might think about it for a really long time. It helped me immensely in understanding why so many people, including myself, have been disenchanted and disconnected from politics because it's intentional. There have been strategies designed to create chaos and confusion so that citizens feel like they don't matter, which makes them apathetic. Well, it does matter. And I sincerely hope that apathy does not win out in any one person's experience this election and beyond, but even more so that apathy doesn't win over democracy this election. Andrew also talked about how important it is to register to vote and to continue to check your registration because of these voter suppression tactics, especially if you live in a swing state. And so you can check at vote.org anytime. And he recommended that you check it literally every week, especially if you live in a swing state, because you could all of a sudden just get removed from the rolls and not be able to vote. And that is terrifying. And that it's best to vote early. So voting early also helps with the voter suppression tactics, but as well, it takes the load off of all these campaigns so that they can focus on people who haven't voted yet. Like you get removed from call lists, you get removed from email, all the things if you vote early. And so he and I actually talked about, I brought up the idea of doing an early voting party, which we might do. And so you'll hear more about that if it does happen, because it's fun to vote. It feels like you're contributing. There's this experience. You get your sticker. You're in line with other people. It makes you feel connected to your community, which to me is really important. It's a very connective experience. And so voting early feels kind of like I don't get to have that experience with my community, but maybe you do if we figure out ways to do this differently. And so I'm working on that, and I'm going to get in touch with all of you about it. And in fact, yesterday, I dropped off my forms to become an election clerk to work at the polls so that I can be a part of the day and to help out locally. But I found out that you can vote early in person. and you can like have the same experience where you're like in your little pod and you're filling your things out. And so definitely take a look. And I'm going to try to send you all some resources and put them up on the website about how you can vote early and have that experience. But please, please, please vote early. And Andrew shared that even though he never votes early, he is voting early this year for many reasons. And so please follow his example. He is very wise. So we follow his example. Okay. So the next episode was episode 6, in which we connected with Reverend David Wallace, another teacher from my seminary who is incredibly wise and very well read. He is an interspiritual teacher and also a political junkie. So it was great to have a conversation with him. And again, David and I could have talked for hours about so many topics, including how spirituality and politics intersect. But the key takeaway for me from that episode was that contrary to some spiritual people feeling that they are somehow above politics, like, oh, it doesn't matter, it's not part of the spiritual evolution, whatever the reasoning is, that's spiritual bypassing. It's political bypassing, which is spiritual bypassing. Because the political self, which is a term I had never heard of or thought of, but David introduced it to us. The political self is actually an essential part of our spiritual experience and spiritual path. And engaging in and contributing to the society we are a part of is an integral human and spiritual experience. So important. So no matter what you believe, please vote. And if you are spiritual, all the more reason that you should be voting. Being spiritual doesn't mean that you are above politics. It means that you are absolutely a part of politics. We are spiritual beings having a human experience, and part of that human experience is politics, because it is how we create society and it is how we create community. And you need to be engaged in creating that community and not just on the outskirts, basically being at the whim of other people who are engaging in community building. That is all of our responsibility as spiritual beings having a human experience. Okay. In episode 7, I shared some of the instances of connection that I saw at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, ranging from how politicians and speakers showed up more authentically than I've previously seen, which leads to more connection. How it was more of an interfaith gathering, bringing more spiritual diversity and spiritual language to the table. Shout out to Pete Buttigieg casually dropping the term soulcraft, which I loved. And how the general theme of the convention was our shared responsibility to care for one another, highlighting the truth and importance of interconnectedness. But I think the 2 highlights for me in that episode were 2 quotes from the convention. I know one of them has been shared a ton, but it deserves to be shared again and spoken aloud again. Raphael Warnock said, quote, "A vote is a kind of prayer for the world we desire for ourselves and for our children." Whether you are religious or not, I think that is such a compelling idea, that a vote is choosing and putting out into the world and asking for the world that we want to live in and we want to leave as a legacy, whether we have children or not. The second thing that really has stuck with me is part of the indoctrination prayer from Bishop Leah Daughtry, which really struck me because it felt like the most accurate and beautiful way to describe where we are as a country and what we're experiencing. This is part of like a larger prayer that she did. But for me, this is the part that really struck me. And I think it helps us to be real about where we are. She said, "We gather at a critical time in our nation when we are at the crossroads of hopelessness and hopefulness. When the forces of good and evil so plainly battle for the hearts and minds of our people. When right is called wrong and wrong is called right. When up is called down and down is called up. When fake is called fact and fact is called fake. When it seems truth is forever on the scaffold and wrong is forever on the throne. Ugh. This also speaks to what Andrew Zorro was talking about with apathy being the downfall of democracy. This experience, when right is called wrong and wrong is called right, when up is called down and down is called up, when fake is called fact and fact is called fake, and when it seems truth is forever on the scaffold and wrong is forever on the throne. Those experiences, that which she describes, is what is creating apathy. And we have to rise above it. We have to rise above it and make decisions. We have to seek out our own clarity and our own answers. And we have to seek out community so that we can support one another in making choices so that we can contribute to what we are meant to be contributing to in building this community, in building this society, and building a country that is the type of country and the type of place that we want our children to live in and that we want to live in. That is the prayer. Oh, so good. That keeps sitting with me, and I'm so grateful for her beautiful words. Okay. Episodes 8 and 9 were actually a series because they were both with Rabbi Salem Pierce, and they were actually one conversation that was split into 2 episodes. So in episode 8, the first of the episodes speaking to religious leaders about the teachings of a religion and then what those teachings then lead followers to value and accordingly how they vote, Rabbi Salem shared some of the core teachings of Judaism and what Jews largely believe about some of the core policies at play in this election. The 2 highlights for me in that episode were that traditionally, about 80% of Jews vote Democrat for a number of reasons, but most notably to me because they believe in caring for the marginalized and strangers, as they have been marginalized and were once strangers themselves. So powerful. And also that it is essential for them as a minority to have a thriving, multicultural, multiracial democracy. That is what we should have in this country, and we don't have it. And I really hope that we're moving towards it. I also personally loved hearing how Jewish mythology states that on the 6th day, when God created man, he created man to be stewards of the earth, which makes it our responsibility to care for the earth and all living beings. I really love that. Okay, so episode 9 was the second half of my discussion with Rabbi Salem. She and I spoke about the Israeli-Palestine conflict and why she has been an advocate for a ceasefire and diplomacy from day one. So this is why this was split up into 2 episodes, because I was so glad that she was willing to talk to me about this. And it was wonderful to talk to a rabbi with strong Jewish roots and beliefs about their understanding of this conflict. And it was also really helpful to hear Rabbi Salem's own personal experience with being in Israel before the conflict and what she was seeing in terms of how Palestinians were being treated and how that is often hidden. And so I really enjoyed getting her perspective and also hearing about her personal experiences and her vision. So in that episode, we also talked about how to talk to people who have different beliefs and opinions, especially about politics or about the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Obviously, that's a very key topic. And in Judaism, questioning things and disagreeing is a valuable experience. And actually a value for Jewish people is to disagree and to have conversations and to question things and to analyze things. And I really appreciate that. So her insights were incredibly valuable. All right. So in episode 10, we connected with Brian Recker, an ex-evangelical pastor who has been deconstructing his faith and following the spirituality of Jesus rather than the religion about Jesus since he left the church. He had so much to share with us, and I'm expecting that I will probably talk to him again. I'll probably talk to a lot of these people again on the podcast eventually. But like in episode 8 with Rabbi Salem, we talked about all the issues that are at play and what Jesus might think of them, from taxes to abortion to climate change. It's a fascinating conversation. So his view of Christianity and Jesus's teachings are really in alignment with what I believe Jesus wanted people to learn and do. So almost every part of the conversation was a highlight for me, because I think it's so important for Christians to look at the way that Jesus lived and live by his example instead of what some of the propaganda that's been created by the church over 2,000 years has taught them and how it's been skewed. And so it's, to me, always about going back to the example that Jesus lived and what he shared. That said, some of the key points that struck me were him talking about how Jesus died as an enemy of the state, which is not something that a lot of people talk about. He was standing up against oppressive forces to advocate for the marginalized, which is the example that he set. He was taking care of the poor. He was taking care of the people who are not cared about. He was taking care of the oppressed. He was advocating for the oppressed and marginalized. And that was why he was killed. Not just for sins. It was because he was actually standing up for the poor. So he was a radical advocate and activist, and that was why he was killed. So his example was not to be the oppressor, but rather to help the oppressed. Such an important conversation. And then the second piece that really struck me from what Brian talked about, one of so many, is he spoke about how in the Bible, heaven is described as a place where every tribe, tongue, and nation comes together with one voice, and how Christians pray on earth as it is in heaven. And so why are Christians not striving to create heaven here on earth with every tribe, tongue, and nation coming together with one voice? It is about unity, not about separation. It is about connection, not disconnection. And it is about collectivism and diversity and unity, and not about individualism. He did also mention to that point about people building their own kingdoms instead of contributing to the larger kingdom of heaven. And I thought that was really interesting. So anyways, that's a great episode. That's episode 10. Okay. And then episode 11 was one that I had been wanting to put together from day one. It was one of the reasons that I started the podcast, because I had so many questions about all these donation requests that I was getting. And specifically, like, why do you need money? What is it for? And where will my donation have the most impact? Like, should I keep giving to Kamala's campaign, or should I give other places? And how do I give to the things that I care about? After trying to connect with, I will be honest, probably 20 people to come on the podcast to talk about donations, I finally hit the jackpot, and it feels so meant to be that Brian Derrick ended up being the guest after all of those outreaches. He is one of the founders of Oath, and he agreed to come on the podcast and join me. And it just was a huge win for me. So he answered all of my questions about donations and political financing, and then some. The key takeaway for me was probably understanding how fundraising works, and that a campaign will raise money until the end of election day, no matter what. No matter what, they'll just keep raising money, right? Of course, that's their jobs. They're fundraisers. They're supposed to be raising money. Great. But there is no break. And so some campaigns, like Kamala's, aren't the best ones to give money to once they have enough money. So there's no like strategic place or strategic way that this like larger body says, okay, you have enough money, stop. We're going to now start taking money from that campaign and putting it towards these other campaigns. That doesn't happen. And I think if you donate to the Dems, to the Democrats, they might sort of move money around. But Oath does this all for you now, which is amazing. So thank goodness, because there are some strategic places to put your money, and sometimes you will have a much bigger impact with races that you don't even know about. So thank goodness for Brian and his team. They created Oath, which you can find at oath.vote. So www.oath.vote. And they do all of this work for you using data and social science and algorithms and who knows what. I have no idea. They have 7 full-time staff, and they've somehow created this incredible organization and tool. And basically you can donate either by saying, okay, I want to donate to this specific thing like climate change or to abortion rights or to, beating Trump or saving democracy or whatever it is. Or you can say, I want to donate to the most impactful elections right now. And all of the data, this thing that they've created, it decides exactly where your money should go right now, in this moment, right now. And he specifically has said, stop donating to Kamala. That's not where money is needed. And so they do all of this work for you and determine where to put your money without selling your information. They will not push deadlines on you or use any type of tactics. And they will even let you know after the election how your money had an impact and like where it went and how it worked. So it was also fascinating for me to hear about how political fundraising and finance works in general and how shady. I mean, I knew that super PACs could be shady. Some of them are good, but some of them are like really shady. Some of them even like doing political organizing and campaigning so that they don't have restrictions on them. But I didn't know that was possible. I thought that PACs were just kind of like the financial engine, but it turns out that they can actually take action as well. So that was fascinating. And I was like, we clearly need to reform everything. And Brian was like, yes, we do. We need massive campaign finance reform. And fundraising is also a tool. Like it is a tool for us to have an impact. And so I hope that over time it will become a question of like, let's do the reform and have this be smart and restricted and reformed, but also that we can use our money to have an impact within reason and in a way that actually makes sense. And then in this past Sunday's episode 12, we got to connect with the incredible Reverend Carla. Rev Carla is an ex-Southern Baptist turned deconstructed interfaith badass and sassy TikTok mama bear. Those are all my terms. Rev Carla talked to us about patriarchy and toxic masculinity and how they play out in religious communities, but also how it's impacting our entire society and how now is the time to dismantle it. We need to dismantle all of this toxicity and come back to a place of balance with divine masculine and divine feminine energy, which are very different than toxic masculine. So there were two highlights that really stood out for me with my conversation with Rev Carla, but honestly, like every episode, this one is worth listening to the whole thing. So the first was that pastors are considered quote unquote chosen by God in these communities. So they're chosen by church leadership and they sort of get moved up. It's very political, but they are human. So it is understood that they are fallible in human terms, but they cannot do any wrong. They can do no wrong in the congregation's eyes. And the congregation is expected to revere and support them no matter what they do because they are chosen by God. For me, I don't know anyone can decide that someone is chosen by God. That's not okay. And I think God would have a lot of problems with that, as would Jesus. Big time. Okay. So what also was interesting to me is that this tactic has been passed along to Donald Trump. So in these communities, people are being told that Donald Trump has been chosen by God. And so there is no other choice. And so even if you look at someone and you think, I have questions about this person, it's like, well, that doesn't matter. Your thoughts, your opinions, your feelings don't matter because this person is chosen by God, and that is all that matters. Oh, that's really upsetting. So it's a terrifying indoctrination tactic. And related, the second highlight was Carla talking about how Christian white women are so entrenched in this patriarchal system and sort of without realizing they're contributing to a system that marginalizes them. So they sort of help to perpetuate this system. And at the same time, it's completely destroying them as people. It's completely against themselves. And so these communities breed a lack of self-agency and a lack of self-trust because you're told you can't have an opinion. You just need to go with what your pastor says. You can't have an opinion or a feeling about this or a voice because you just go along with what the church is telling you. So upsetting. So Great episode so far. So we've talked to spiritual leaders, we've talked to political strategists, we've talked about how to get involved. And here we are, episode 13. It's actually my favorite number, so good timing. So you can go back and listen to any of those episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Just go to the number, and also the person's name is there. And you can find information, resources, and links for each episode on the website at theconnectedway.com/podcast. And now let's get into a little bit about what you can expect for the rest of the season. We will be connecting with experts on Christian nationalism, misinformation and disinformation, and having difficult conversations. How do we do that? How do we talk across party lines? You will hear at least one conversation that I will have across party lines. And we'll also hear from more spiritual teachers, including my favorite American Indigenous teacher, hopefully an astrologer, maybe a Buddhist teacher, amongst others. And I hope to chat with people who have different perspectives and different sort of stakeholders in this election. That's my hope. Well, I can tell you some of what you can expect. I can't tell you everything because I will be honest that it is constantly shaping. Most weeks, the episodes have been scheduled and recorded right before they go live. And everything has been very fast moving because I started this really quickly because I was called to do it. But it has been a crash course in learning how to podcast. I knew that it was going to be demanding and hard, but I had no idea what creating a podcast would require of me. And honestly, I've never been more inspired or more consumed by something potentially in my life. It feels incredibly right. And like I'm absolutely meant to be doing this. And also I've shared with friends that I'm so busy, but it's like inspired busy, not burdened busy. So it feels good. I will keep this up until the election. It's an experiment, and I expect that the podcast will hopefully continue. That's my plan if I can. And it will shift. I definitely don't expect to be doing 2 episodes a week after the election because I need to be able to focus on other things in my life and in the work that I'm building and in supporting the Connected Way and its mission and vision. And it's possible I might even take a little bit of a break in between the election and starting back up again, but that all remains to be seen. This is a constant practice of letting go and following what is happening and listening and seeing what happens. So it's an exercise in surrender and trust. And I trust that what is meant to come together will come together. And I'm continuously leading into this giant leap of faith. It means the world for me that you are here. I cannot tell you how much it means. This podcast has taught me a lot and is incredibly energizing and inspiring, but it is for you. It's for all of us to be more connected, to live more connected, and hopefully to collectively move towards connection. So please continue to listen and please connect. Post and comments on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn posts, whatever. I'd love to hear about what you're hearing and learning and what sticks out for you. And please share. I hope to build an audience of people who are interested in connection and who want to move the needle on this election, but then beyond that, also want to live lives more connected and believe that connection is our path moving forward as a society. So thank you for being here, and I will see you on the next episode. Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Connected Way. You can find all the resources mentioned in the show and even more resources in the show notes and on the podcast page at theconnectedway.com/podcast. Before you go, a note about sponsorship. This podcast is currently sponsored by me, Rev Dev, and you, the listeners. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and the work of The Connected Way, enhancing individual and collective connection to self, others, the land, and spirituality, you can donate on the podcast webpage. There is never any pressure or expectation, but if you feel called to support the work, any contribution of any amount helps, as do your good thoughts. And finally, I'd love to hear your biggest takeaway from today's show. What inspired you? What surprised you or made you think? Let me know by posting a comment on any of the posts or DMing me on Instagram, or of course, you can always send me a message on the website. Thanks again for being here, friends. May this podcast bring more connection to you and the collective. And so it is. See you next time.